Okay, so I just want to go over the whole menstrual cycle and what happens if you get pregnant and what happens if you don't get pregnant. So First Aid has everything in its book, but the order is really whack and it doesn't really explain the proper process of what exactly happens. So there's this picture called the menstrual cycle here, and it's a really good picture, but it's all scattered. The information's across a few pages, so I just want to explain. So we all know that females go through this menstrual cycle. They may be cramping at times, and they are bleeding out terrible blood through their vagina once a month. And we know that this is when they're menstruating, meaning they're releasing their eggs, ready for the guys to really fertilize with their sperm to make a baby. So we know this is happening every 28 days. This is broken down into two phases called the follicular phase, which lasts for the first half of the 28 days, then the luteal phase. Now, we all know that the whole gist of it is that estrogen and progesterone play a big role in this, in the sense that you are going to get a thickening of your endometrium because of your estrogen, and there's going to be more secretory parts of it because of the progesterone. But the whole tie-in of how the egg is released and what is actually happening to form this estrogen and progesterone is sort of worth going over. So let's start off with the start of the cycle, which is also the end of the cycle. And it starts off pretty poorly. Essentially, the start of the cycle, about the first few days of the cycle in the follicular phase, you are going to have this thing called menses. So menses is essentially what you think. It's menstruating, so that's when you are bleeding out blood out of your uterus or your vagina. So what this means is that the thickened endometrium layer that was ready to foster a child didn't actually get a sperm in there to fertilize the egg to get a zygote. So all that is going to waste. It's a shedding away. That shedding away is the menses, and that's the blood. So now what happens? So normally we know that the hypothalamus secretes GnRH, and this stimulates the anterior pituitary to stimulate these two hormones called follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And essentially, you see here that these FSH and LH are starting to increase estrogen over here. But it's important to go back a few pages and look at what the follicle actually is made up of. So if I just go over here, we know that the main gonads of the female is an ovary. And the ovary contains a bunch of eggs and a bunch of follicles. So essentially, an egg is surrounded by, this is an egg over here, and it's surrounded by a layer called a follicle. And these follicle cells contain two main things. If we go back here, again, this is the egg, and this is the follicle. And these follicles, the outside of it is called theca cells, and the inside of it is called the granulosa cells. The theca cells respond to LH, as I said, and it essentially forms this thing called androstenedione. Now, this androstenedione can pass through a gap junction right into the granulosa cell. And it's in the granulosa cell, it essentially, because it holds aromatase, the enzyme important to form estrogen, it forms estrogen. But it only forms estrogen when FSH is also stimulating it. And it works out because GnRH stimulates LH as well as FSH at the same time. So all in all, you are making estrogen. Now, okay, so we established that we are making estrogen now because of GnRH, and we see estrogen actually going up a bit here. Now, what is estrogen doing? Well, estrogen's main role is proliferative. Its whole point is to make sure it proliferates and thickens your endometrial lining of your uterus. And why do you want to do that? Well, you're prepping yourself for pregnancy. You want to make sure that you have a very thick uterus so that your body can handle the stress of a baby, and it is being incubated and warm, and it's basically increasing the muscle mass. So if we read over here, estrogen, main thing, endometrial proliferation, and there's a bunch of inhibitory and surge effects that we want to talk about, but I don't think it does a very good role over here. So talking about estrogen now, we're at the estrogen level. We established that we have estrogen now. Now what happens? Well, if we look over here, FSH and LH are actually sort of decreasing over here when estrogen is increased. What happens is that estrogen had both a negative feedback effect as well as a positive feedback effect later. So the initial negative feedback is when estrogen increases, it's actually going to go all the way back to the hypothalamus and decrease GnRH. It's going to decrease FSH and LH. Now, why do you want to do this? Well, we know that FSH and LH are for the granulosa and theca cells of the follicle of the ovary. It's basically nourishing the ovary. And we already know that in an ovary, there are dozens or thousands, hundreds of essentially many eggs. And you really only want one egg to develop into a mature follicle. So essentially, you start with primordial follicles, which become primary follicles, secondary follicles, and eventually, when it becomes a mature follicle, it's going to burst out. But you only have so much energy in your actual body, so you don't want like all of the ovaries becoming mature follicles. You want only one of them. So basically, when you inhibit FSH and LH, you're decreasing the stimulation to the ovary so that only one mature follicle can develop and the rest of them degenerate into other polar bodies. So now you have one main mature follicle, which is eventually going to be fertilized by a sperm. So what happens now? Well, when your body senses that you have a mature follicle and you're good to go, estrogen actually switches its effect. It now becomes a positive feedback mechanism on your GnRH. And the anterior pituitary now secretes even more FSH and LH, and this is what you call an LH surge. So here you see when estrogen is increasing and the mature follicle has developed, LH just spikes, and this is what you call an LH surge. So now when LH is increased, it's actually going to release a few things. Doesn't say here, but essentially LH is going to make sure it's releasing metalloproteinases so it can degrade the oocyte wall, the ovary wall, because eventually LH surge, the whole point is for ovulation. And we know ovulation is when the egg bursts out of the ovary. And to do this, you need metalloproteinases to degrade this wall, and yeah, that's basically it. So now we've established that estrogen, positive feedback later causes LH surge and ovulation. So just a thing I want to point out here, that if we zoom in here, LH surge happens actually about 1 day before ovulation actually happens. So that's just a key point to make sure. So now that we have ovulation, this egg is going to burst out of the ovary. It's going to travel through the ampulla, through the fallopian tube, and implant somewhere in the posterior wall of the uterus. Okay, so now we have the egg inside the uterus, and all we need is some penis to go inside of the vagina and ejaculate and get the sperm in here so you can fertilize the egg into a zygote and form a baby. However, what happens if this girl is lonely, she doesn't have a boyfriend, and this is not going to happen? So what happens is that this thing forms corpus luteum, which is just this bursted out follicle, and it degenerates. It doesn't do anything. It just doesn't do anything, and all that thickened layer that you had now is just going to slough off, and here you are at the beginning of your cycle again, depressed and bleeding. Okay? However, what if she does have a partner? She does get sperm in there, which fertilizes the egg. What's going to happen is that the egg and the sperm are going to form a zygote and implant somewhere in the posterior wall. Now, once the zygote matures after a few days, for about 10 days, I believe, what's going to happen is that this is going to form a few key parts of the placenta. So if we go back again in the first aid, here we go. So once the placenta starts forming, it forms two things, the cytotrophoblast and the syncytotrophoblast. The syncytotrophoblast is the main thing. The syncytotrophoblast synthesizes hormone. The main thing being HCG. So what does HCG do? Let's go back over here. So HCG actually makes sure to go back to the corpus luteum and tell it to stay. That, hey man, we actually got a sperm and we're good to go. So the corpus luteum stays, and what it does is produce estrogen as well as progesterone. Now, progesterone is the main hormone here that we need to think of, because progesterone is pro-gestation, and this is where all your pregnancy effects come from. So in first aid, they have progesterone over here, and it's sort of a list, it's sort of hard to understand. But the main thing is it's for secretions, right? It's in the proliferative phase. So this is secretions come from arteries, so spiral artery development and glandular secretions to make sure that you are nourishing your endometrium, which was proliferated by your estrogen. So progesterone maintains pregnancy, and it inhibits these LH-FSH because you don't want to get pregnant again. You're good to go. Why would you want to be making any more eggs if you're already pregnant, right? The other thing is that it produces thick cervical mucus, which inhibits sperm entry in the uterus, right? Why would you want to fertilize another egg that you're not making in the first place? Just a waste of energy. And it also does smooth muscle relaxation of the uterine. And this is really important because if you give prostaglandins to a person who is pregnant, this may cause contractions of your uterus, and this might abort the fetus. So this is something you definitely do not want to do. So really that is the end of this. And then we all know what happens when pregnancy ends. It's the baby comes out. The last thing is that when progesterone drops right about here after birth, I suppose, your prolactin goes up, and your prolactin causes milk letdown, and you start secreting milk. So that's about it for pregnancy. Let me know if I missed anything.